Hey guys! Tonight we begin with one of the strangest military decisions in ancient history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the year 52 before Christ, Rome's conquest of Gaul ran into a problem, a big one. His name was Vercingetorix. Now Caesar had spent the previous several years doing what Roman generals did best, marching around Gaul with several legions and politely informing tribes that they now belonged to Rome. Some tribes resisted and lost. Some surrendered early and lived slightly longer, and many decided that arguing with men carrying large rectangular shields and very sharp discipline was not worth the effort. So overall, things had been going well. Then Vercingetorix showed up. He was a noble from the Avari tribe, young, ambitious, and dangerously good at convincing other tribes to cooperate. Which from the Roman point of view was extremely rude, because the Gauls usually fought each other almost as often as they fought Rome. Divide and conquer works wonderfully when the dividing part happens naturally, but Vercingetorix ruined that system. Instead of competing with neighboring tribes, he convinced them to unite against the Romans. Suddenly, Gaul wasn't a collection of small problems anymore. It was one large, very motivated problem, and he had another idea that Caesar found deeply annoying. Instead of fighting Roman legions in open battle, Vercingetorix adopted a scorched earth strategy. Villages were burned before the Romans arrived, food supplies destroyed, fields emptied. In other words, if Caesar wanted dinner, he was going to have to bring it with him. This strategy was extremely effective and extremely frustrating. Roman armies were tough, disciplined, and very good at stabbing people in formation. But even the best legionary cannot eat a sword. So for a while, Vercingetorix successfully slowed the Roman advance. The countryside became hostile, empty, and very uncooperative. But then he made a decision that would become famous. He withdrew his army into the fortified hilltop settlement of Alesia. From a defensive perspective, it looked perfect. The town sat on a plateau surrounded by valleys and steep slopes. Natural terrain protected it on nearly every side. Strong walls guarded the entrance. To the Gauls, it looked like a safe stronghold. To Caesar, it looked like a container. And Caesar had a habit of building very effective lids. Now, if you're a Roman general staring at a fortified hilltop city full of rebellious ghouls, you have a few obvious options. You can attack the walls, you can try to storm the gates, or you can stand outside, sigh heavily, and begin a massive construction project. Caesar chose option 3, because here's the thing about attacking fortresses in the ancient world. It's messy. You lose a lot of soldiers, ladders get pushed over, rocks get dropped on your head, and suddenly your glorious campaign turns into a very expensive disaster. Caesar preferred efficiency, so instead of attacking Alesia, he decided to trap it. The plan was simple in theory. Surround the entire hilltop settlement with fortifications so no one could get in or out. Once the Gauls ran out of food, they would either surrender or try to break out. And when they tried to break out, the Romans would be waiting. This type of siege tactic is called circumventillation, a fancy Latin word meaning, "We are building a wall around you, and you are now our problem." And the Roman army was exceptionally good at building things. Roman soldiers were not just fighters. They were engineers, laborers, carpenters, trench diggers, and part-time architects. Every legionary carried tools along with weapons, which meant when Caesar said, let's build 18 kilometers of fortifications. Nobody asked follow-up questions. They just started digging. First came the trenches. 2 massive ditches were dug around the entire hill, each several meters wide and deep. One of them was even filled with water diverted from nearby rivers. Because if someone tries to charge you, it's helpful if they first have to swim. Behind the trenches came earthen ramparts reinforced with wooden palisades. Watchtowers were placed at regular intervals, so Roman soldiers could monitor the entire perimeter. Within weeks, the Romans had constructed a complete ring around Alesia. Inside the city, Vercingetorix and his warriors watched thousands of Roman soldiers calmly building what was essentially a giant cage. And the worst part, that they were doing it with remarkable efficiency. No panic, no rushing, just disciplined soldiers digging trenches, raising towers, and quietly surrounding the hill. From the Gauls' perspective, the problem remained serious. Caesar had roughly 60,000 soldiers. That included legionaries, cavalry, and auxiliaries, which meant that if the relief army arrived while the Gauls inside Alesia attacked at the same time, the Romans could find themselves in a very uncomfortable position, surrounded by enemies on both sides. Imagine it. Inside the fortress, Vercingetorix commands tens of thousands of warriors. Outside the walls, another massive GIC army approaches, and in between them sits the Roman army, politely occupying the worst possible location. It's like volunteering to be the filling in a battlefield sandwich. For most generals, this would be the moment to abandon the siege and retreat. Caesar did not retreat. Instead, he looked at the problem and decided the solution was obvious. He would build another wall. Yes, another one. Because if you are about to be surrounded by enemies, the logical Roman response is apparently to begin another construction project. This second line of fortifications would face outward, protecting the Roman army from the incoming relief force, which meant Caesar's army would soon stand between 2 giant walls, one facing the enemy trapped inside Alesia, the other facing the enemy approaching from outside. In other words, Caesar was about to lock himself inside the middle of a battlefield, which sounds insane, but Roman engineering had a way of making insane plans work. So Caesar did what any calm, rational Roman general would do when faced with the possibility of being attacked from 2 directions. He ordered the construction of another wall. This one faced outward. The Romans called this second line of fortifications contravallation, which essentially means a wall built to protect you from the people trying to rescue the people you already trapped. Latin was very efficient like that. Now Caesar's army stood between 2 massive defensive systems. The inner wall facing Alesia kept Vercingetorix and his warriors locked inside the fortress. The outer wall facing the countryside would protect the Romans from the incoming relief army. It was a bold solution, also slightly terrifying because Caesar had effectively placed his entire army inside a giant ring of fortifications with enemies on both sides. If either wall failed, things could become extremely unpleasant very quickly. But Roman soldiers did not panic. They grabbed their tools, because once again, the Roman army turned into the most disciplined construction crew in ancient history. The second line stretched even farther than the first. Nearly 21 kilometers of trenches, ramparts, towers, and defensive obstacles were constructed facing outward toward the open countryside. That meant the total length of Roman fortifications around Alesia now approached 40 kilometers. 40 kilometers. That is not a battlefield. That is urban planning. Trenches were dug first, just like before. Behind them rose earthen walls reinforced with timber. Wooden towers were placed at regular intervals so Roman archers could fire down on approaching attackers. The two defensive rings were connected by Roman camps and supply lines. From above, the entire structure must have looked like a massive double circle carved into the landscape. And right in the middle of those circles sat the Roman army, calmly preparing for one of the strangest battles in military history. Inside Alicia, Versing now faced a grim reality. The Romans had not only surrounded him, they had also prepared for his rescue. And somewhere beyond the hills, the GIC relief army was marching closer. When they arrived, the Romans would be attacked from two directions at the same time, which meant Caesar had successfully created the world's most dangerous waiting room. Building two walls was impressive, but Caesar knew walls alone were not enough, because if tens of thousands of GIC warriors decided to charge those fortifications at the same time, sheer numbers could overwhelm even Roman discipline. So, the Romans did what they always did best. They engineered the battlefield itself. In front of the outer walls, Roman soldiers began constructing layers of defensive traps designed to slow, injure, and completely ruin the day of anyone attempting an assault. First came the trenches, deep ditches dug into the earth wide enough to break the momentum of charging troops. Anyone running toward the Roman ramparts would suddenly find themselves dropping several feet into a muddy obstacle, which is not ideal if someone with a spear is waiting on the other side. Then came the stakes. Thousands of sharpened wooden stakes were driven into the ground at angles. Some were visible, many were hidden. The hidden ones were particularly unpleasant. The Romans dug small pits, placed sharpened stakes at the bottom, and carefully covered them with brush and soil. From a distance, the field looked harmless until the first warrior stepped forward and discovered gravity. These traps were known by the Romans as lees, because the sharpened stakes, supplies that might normally last weeks, suddenly had to feed an entire trapped population. And food disappears surprisingly fast when thousands of hungry people are involved. Day after day, the Romans continued building, digging, and strengthening their fortifications. From the walls of Alesia, the Gauls could see the siege tightening. No one was coming in. No one was leaving. Eventually, the inevitable happened. Rations were reduced. Animals were slaughtered. Whatever grain had been stored inside the city began to run low, and the situation grew desperate. At some point, the leaders inside Alesia made a brutal decision. The non-combatants would have to leave. Women, children, and elderly civilians were sent out of the city in the hope that the Romans would allow them to pass through the siege lines and find safety. It was a desperate gamble, but Caesar refused. Allowing them through would weaken the siege. The Gauls might attempt to escape alongside them. Supplies could potentially be smuggled back in. So the gates of Alesia closed behind the civilians, and the Roman walls remained closed ahead of them. The result was tragic. Thousands of people were left trapped between the two lines of fortifications, unable to return to the city and unable to pass through the Roman defenses. It was one of the darkest moments of the siege. Ancient warfare was not gentle. And while Caesar's strategy was militarily brilliant, it came with a brutal human cost. Meanwhile, the Romans kept waiting, because somewhere beyond the hills, the relief army was still coming. And when it arrived, everything would change. Eventually, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. Roman scouts began reporting movement beyond the hills surrounding Alesia. Dust clouds on the horizon, columns of warriors approaching from every direction. The GIC relief army had arrived. For the soldiers inside Alesia, the sight must have felt like salvation. From the walls, they could see banners and war bands gathering in the distance. Allies from across Gaul had answered the call. At last, the siege might be broken. For Caesar and his legions, the same sight produced a very different reaction, because now the Roman army was exactly where no army ever wants to be. In the middle behind them sat Vercingetorix and the trapped army of Alesia. In front of them stood the newly arrived relief force. Two enemies, two directions, and one Roman army caught between them. If the Gauls coordinated their attacks correctly, the Romans could be overwhelmed. It was the nightmare scenario Caesar had anticipated when he ordered the second wall built. And now that nightmare was becoming reality. The GIC relief army was enormous. Ancient writers described warriors pouring into the valleys around Alesia like a tide. Campfires dotted the hills. Horns echoed through the countryside. The Roman fortifications suddenly looked less like a clever siege and more like a defensive ring holding back a storm. Inside Alesia, morale surged. Vercingetorix knew that if the relief army attacked from outside, while his own warriors attacked from within, the Romans would be forced to fight on two fronts at the same time. Even disciplined legions struggle when enemies are attacking from opposite directions. The plan was simple. The relief army would assault the outer Roman walls. At the same moment, the warriors inside Alesia would launch their own attack against the inner fortifications. The Romans would be squeezed between two massive assaults. If even one section of the Roman line collapsed, the siege would break. Thousands of GIC warriors would flood through the gap. And suddenly, the Roman army would be the one trapped. So now everything depended on the walls, the trenches, the traps, the towers. All the engineering Caesar had ordered in the previous weeks was about to face its first real test, because the GIC armies were preparing to attack from both sides. The first attack came from the outside. At dawn, the GIC relief army began to move across the valley toward the Roman fortifications. Thousands of warriors advanced in loose formations, shields raised, war horns sounding across the fields. From the Roman towers, the view must have been impressive. Also slightly concerning, because no matter how good your walls are, watching a massive army march toward you tends to raise the heart rate. But Roman soldiers had prepared for exactly this moment. As the GIC warriors advanced, they encountered the first obstacle, the trenches. The front rank suddenly found themselves slowing, bunching together as they tried to cross the deep ditches carved into the earth. And slowing down was the worst thing they could do. From the towers above, Roman archers and slingers opened fire. Arrows began falling into the crowded ranks below. Stones from slings cracked against shields and helmets. Then came the traps. Some warriors tried to move around the trenches only to step into hidden pits. Others tripped over a roor. Warriors from inside Alesia launched their own assault against the inner fortifications. The Romans were now under simultaneous attack from both directions, and the weak point was starting to buckle. Roman soldiers in the valley fought desperately to hold the rampart. Arrows flew from the towers. Legionaries hurled javelins into the advancing ranks, but the Gauls kept coming. Wave after wave pressed forward. Some fell into trenches, others climbed over obstacles. Ladders slammed against the ramparts. For the first time during the siege, the Roman line began to bend. And when a defensive line bends too far, it breaks. Messengers raced to Caesar's command post, reporting the situation. The sector in the valley was under enormous pressure. If it collapsed, the entire Roman position could unravel. Because once a gap opened in the wall, thousands of GIC warriors would flood through. At that moment, Caesar made a decision. He would personally ride to the threatened section, and if necessary, he would lead the defense himself because sometimes the general has to enter the fight. When the reports reached Caesar's command post, the situation was becoming critical. The valley sector of the Roman defenses was under enormous pressure. Thousands of GIC warriors were attacking the weakened section of the outer wall, while Vercingetorix's forces inside Alesia were launching simultaneous assaults against the inner line. The Romans were being squeezed. For a few tense moments, it looked like the GIC plan might actually work. But Caesar was not the type of commander who stayed comfortably behind the lines while things fell apart. Instead, he mounted his horse and rode directly toward the most dangerous part of the battlefield. Ancient writers describe him wearing his famous red cloak, which Roman generals often used as a signal of command. From a modern perspective, wearing a bright red cloak while riding into a chaotic battlefield full of angry enemies might not sound like the safest fashion choice, but symbolism mattered. Roman soldiers recognized their commander immediately, and that mattered even more. As Caesar arrived near the threatened sector, he began organizing reinforcements. Fresh units were moved into position. Reserves were ordered forward. Officers were given direct instructions on where to strengthen the line. But Caesar did more than give orders. He made himself visible. He rode along the ramparts where the fighting was most intense, encouraging the soldiers and personally directing the defense. For Roman legionaries, seeing their general on the battlefield was powerful motivation. Caesar had built a reputation for sharing the dangers of his army. He was not a distant commander. He was there. And suddenly, the morale of the Roman soldiers surged. The line that had begun to bend stabilized. Legionaries fought harder. Units held their positions. The attackers still pressed forward in massive numbers, but the defenders were no longer faltering. Meanwhile, Caesar prepared the next move because holding the wall was not enough. The relief army outside still had enormous numbers, and as long as they kept attacking, the Romans would remain under extreme pressure. To end the battle, Caesar needed to break the attackers themselves, and for that, he had one more card to play: the Roman cavalry. And when those horsemen moved, the balance of the entire battle would shift. By this point in the battle, the situation was hanging on a knife's edge. The Roman defenses had barely held against the GAC assault in the valley. Caesar's arrival had stabilized the line, but the pressure was still immense. Thousands of warriors were still pushing toward the ramparts, hoping that sheer numbers might finally break the Roman position. Caesar understood something critical. If the GIC relief army continued attacking in waves, the Romans might eventually be worn down. So instead of waiting for the next assault, he decided to do something the Gauls were not expecting. He would attack them. Caesar gathered his cavalry units, which included Roman horsemen as well as allied Germanic cavalry, who were known for their aggressive fighting style. While the infantry continued holding the walls, the cavalry moved quietly behind the Roman fortifications, preparing to ride around the battlefield. The plan was simple, but bold. Instead of meeting the GIC army head-on, the cavalry would circle around and strike the enemy from the rear. In ancient warfare, this was devastating. Infantry formations depended on facing the enemy in front of them. Shields, weapons, and formations were designed for forward combat. When soldiers suddenly found attackers behind them, confusion spread quickly, and confusion in battle is extremely dangerous. At Caesar's signal, the cavalry surged forward. They rode out from behind the Roman lines, sweeping around the flanks of the GIC relief army. Dust rose from the ground as the horsemen accelerated across the open fields. Then they,